Nora Whitcomb woke before the laundromat lights clicked off. A pale film of breath had silvered the inside of her windshield, and she wiped it with the sleeve of her faded green canvas jacket until the parking lot came back in pieces. The soda machine by the side door, the dumpster with its lid propped to open the white stripe of frost along the curb. Her boots were on the passenger side floor where she had left them, toes packed with yesterday's newspaper to dry the rain out. The old scarf that had belonged to her mother was folded under her cheek, warm only where her face had pressed it all night. She sat still until the ache in her hip found its way into the rest of her body. The laundromat owner had never told her to leave. He had only looked once through the glass door at her car, then at the empty folding tables, and turned the open sign a few minutes later than usual. That mercy, small and wordless, somehow hurt more than being chased away would have. Nora had learned in the last month that kindness could make a person feel seen at the exact moment she wanted most to disappear. Her phone showed 6:12 a.m., 1 bar of battery, and 3 unread messages she did not need to open. The landlord's last notice, a diner coworker asking whether she had found anything yet. A pharmacy reminder for a prescription she had already decided to stretch. She thumbed past them to the note she had saved from the county office because it still seemed like the kind of message meant for someone else. Ms. Nora Whitcomb, please contact the Bellwether probate clerk regarding a personal item left to you by Esther Vale. Esther Vale had lived 2 doors down from Nora's mother when Nora was small enough to believe every porch light had a person waiting behind it. She remembered a narrow woman with white hair braided around her head, a tin of molasses cookies, and hands that smelled faintly of sewing machine oil. Esther had not been family. She had not been close, not in the way people counted closeness on forms, but she had once sat with Nora on the back steps while Nora's mother cuffed behind a closed bedroom door, and she had shown Nora how to wind a kitchen timer without forcing the spring. "Old things tell you when they've had enough," Esther had said. Nora put her boots on, wincing when the cold leather bent around her toes. In the back seat, everything she owned was arranged with the discipline of someone pretending this was temporary. A duffel bag, a plastic bin of papers, 2 diner shirts, a hairbrush, a cracked mug wrapped in a towel, and a shoebox of medical receipts tied with string. She counted the cash in her wallet because not counting it made the number feel worse. $184. Enough for gas, cheap food, maybe 2 nights somewhere if she chose badly. Not enough for a deposit. Not enough for the storage unit due next week. Not enough to turn grief into a plan. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. By 9, she was standing in the lobby of the Bellwether Municipal Building, warming her hands around a paper cup of water because the coffee machine wanted exact change. The place smelled of floor wax, damp wool coats, and copier toner. A bulletin board beside the clerk's window held notices for leaf pickup, a church supper, and a public hearing about surplus township property. The woman behind the glass looked up over half-moon readers. She had silver clips in her hair and a cardigan the color of oatmeal. "You're Nora Whitcomb." "Yes, ma'am. I'm June Bell." The woman's voice was neither bright nor pitying, and Nora was grateful for both absences. "I'm sorry about Mrs. Vale." She passed quietly. "No children living. A nephew signed off on most of the estate from Ohio, but she left a written instruction for one item to come to you." Nora shifted the strap of her duffel higher on her shoulder. "I don't understand why." June slid a folder from one side of the counter to the other. She was very particular. Said you would know how to listen to it. The sentence settled between them like something too fragile to pick up. June led her through a side door and down a narrow hall where framed photographs of old parades hung slightly crooked. At the end was a storage room lined with metal shelves. Election signs leaned against one wall. A broken lectern stood in the corner. On a square of moving blanket beneath a tag with Nora's name written in blue ink sat the clock. It was larger than she expected. Not a mantel clock or kitchen clock, but a heavy round station clock with a brass bezel gone dull around the edges and a white face yellowed toward ivory. Black numbers stood clean and serious under the cloudy glass. Below the face, a narrow wooden case held a pendulum door with a little latch. The wood had once been dark and polished. Now it was scratched pale along the corners where hands had carried it without care. Nora crouched before it. The name of a maker was printed in tiny letters near the 6, but grime had filled the serif strokes. 2 mounting hooks on the back were bent outward. Someone had wrapped the pendulum bob in newspaper and taped it to the inside of the case. "It doesn't run," June said. "The appraiser marked it decorative. No real market value in the condition it's in." Mrs. Vale still insisted. Nora touched the brass rim. It held the room's chill. "Can I sell it?" she asked, then hated herself for asking. June did not blink. "Legally, yes. Morally, I suspect Mrs. Vale hoped you'd wait a little before deciding." Nora looked up. That should have sounded judgmental. It did not. June's hands rested flat on the folder, fingers spread as if keeping the papers from sliding away. "I'm sleeping in my car," Nora said, because it was easier to tell the truth to a woman who had not asked for it. "I don't have anywhere to put a clock this big." June's face changed only at the corners. "Then we'll find cardboard and make the carrying easier." Together, they wrapped the clock in 2 flattened copy paper boxes and a length of twine from the supply shelf. June found an old towel to protect the glass. Nora lifted from the bottom and felt the weight of the thing pull straight into her shoulders. It was not the weight of money. It was the weight of a wall object, a public object, something built to hang where people looked up together. Outside, the wind ran dry leaves along the municipal steps. Nora wedged the clock across the back seat, moving the duffel and paper bin until the brass face tilted toward the rear window. For a moment, seen through the glass, it looked like a passenger too proud to complain. She drove nowhere after that. Nowhere useful, at least. She parked behind the closed hardware store and ate a peanut butter cracker packet from the glove compartment. She called the diner in Meadville and left a message. She checked a job listing for night stock work and saw the bus schedule would not reach it. Then she sat with both hands around her phone while the battery dropped to 11%. In the rear-view mirror, the clock watched the gray afternoon. At 4, rain began again. It tapped the roof of the car with the patient insistence of fingers on a counter. Nora climbed into the back seat to pull her jacket over the clock, worried suddenly that damp might get under the glass. The towel June had given her slipped from the face and fell across the pendulum door. That was when she heard it. Not a chime, not a ring, just one dull, deliberate tick. Nora froze with one knee pressed into the seat cushion. The sound did not repeat. Rain ran down the rear window and blurred the municipal building across the street into a pale block of light. She leaned closer, breath held, and put 2 fingers on the clock case. The wood was cold. The little latch below the face sat crooked in its slot. She opened the pendulum door. Inside, the newspaper around the bob had yellowed and gone soft. The tape gave with a dry sigh when she peeled it back. The pendulum itself was brass heavier than it looked, with a dent near the bottom edge. Behind it, on the inner back, someone had written a small pencil mark, not a word, not a number, only a short vertical line crossed by another at an angle. Nora touched it. A memory rose not as a scene but as a texture. Esther Vale's kitchen table oilcloth worn smooth at the corners, the tiny click of a timer, spring turning under Nora's hand. Her mother's cough in the next room. Esther saying, "Some things keep time because someone is still waiting." Nora closed the pendulum door, but her hand remained on the clock. The rain thickened. Cars hissed past on the road. Her phone went dark in her lap. She should have been thinking about gas, about work, about where a woman could park without being noticed and still feel safe enough to sleep. Instead, she untied the twine, eased the cardboard away from the clock face, and wiped the glass with the corner of her mother's scarf. The minute hand trembled. It moved, once a narrow black blade sliding forward with quiet effort, and stopped. Behind a closed hardware store. There was no reason for Esther Vale, after all those years, to leave Nora the one thing she could least carry, and somehow could not put down. But the hand had moved. In the dim glass of the rear window, Nora saw her own face overlaid with the clock's pale circle, tired eyes, rain shadows, hair coming loose from its tie. Beyond her reflection, the municipal building lights blinked on one by one. The minute hand stayed where it was pointing, just past 12, as if it had used all its strength to make a single mark in time and was waiting for her to notice. By morning, Nora had placed the clock upright on the passenger seat and driven with one hand braced against its wooden case every time the road dipped. The pencil mark inside the pendulum door had bothered her through a thin sleep in the church lot where she had parked under a maple tree and woken twice to make sure the clock had not tipped. In daylight, the little crossed line looked less like a scratch and more like a mark copied from somewhere else. It leaned at an angle firm and intentional the way a person might mark a beam before cutting. At the library, she charged her phone under a table and searched Esther Vale's name. Most of what came up was ordinary obituary church volunteer list, a mention in an article about old Bellwether photographs. Then Nora found one paragraph from a county heritage newsletter 12 years old, describing Esther as a longtime volunteer with the Bellwether Depot archive. The word depot made Nora sit back. Outside, down the road, narrowed along a run of rusted rails half buried in weeds. Brown leaves had packed themselves between the ties. The sky was low and pale, and the hills beyond Bellwether held the last dull copper of October. Nora passed a closed feed store, a row of mill houses with patched porches and a sign for a salvage yard before the depot appeared beyond a chain-link gate. It was longer than she expected. The building stood parallel to the tracks, a weathered strip of clapboard and glass with a slate roof patched in mismatched shingles. One gutter hung loose over the platform, its end twisted down like a broken wrist. The old trackside signs still read Bellwether, though 2 letters had faded to ghosts. Along the platform, several boards had lifted at the ends, silvered by rain and time. A ticket window faced the roadside under a shallow roof line. At the far east end freight doors stood chained shut. The west end was boarded from inside, its windows covered not with plywood, but with old beadboard panels that had been nailed over the glass years ago. A township notice was stapled to a post near the gate. Surplus Property Review. Structural hazard. Public comment period ends November 18. Below that in smaller type were the words Nora read, twice potential salvage disposition. She sat in the idling car until the engine ticked hot under the hood. The clock beside her gave no sound. Its face looked blankly toward the depot, the minute hand still just past 12. "I can't fix a building," Nora said aloud. The clock gave no argument. The gate was not locked, only held shut with a loop of chain. Nora pushed it open enough to slip through, then went back for the clock because leaving it in the car felt suddenly wrong. She carried it against her chest, the brass rim cold through her jacket, and stepped onto the platform with care. The first board groaned but held. The second dipped enough to make her shift her weight fast toward the wall. Close up, the depot smelled of wet leaves, old creosote, and the sourness of trapped rain. Someone had painted over graffiti on the ticket office door with a color that did not match. A swallow's nest clung under the eave, abandoned for the season. Through a cracked pane, she could see a freight scale, a collapsed stack of cardboard boxes, and dust so thick it softened every edge. The front door was closed with a hasp, but not a modern lock. Nora did not touch it. She was still deciding whether walking around an abandoned township building counted as trespassing when a voice came from behind her. "You step on the dark boards you'll go through." She turned too quickly and nearly knocked the clock against the wall. An older man stood near the gate, one hand on the chain, the other holding a paper coffee cup. He wore a brown work coat with sawdust caught in the sleeve seams and a knit cap pulled low over gray hair. His left knee stiffened when he walked, but the rest of him seemed built from patient habits. "I'm sorry," Nora said. "I didn't break in." "No," he said, glancing at the gate. "Township broke out of caring before you got here." She held the clock tighter. "Did you know Esther Vale?" At that, his eyes moved from her face to the clock. Something in his mouth changed, not quite surprise. "I knew Mrs. Vale," he said. "Martin Reyes. My father worked section crew and there was still enough rail here to need one." He nodded toward the platform. "That clock used to hang in the ticket office." Nora looked down at it. The weight in her arms seemed to alter, becoming less random. "She left it to me," Nora said. "I don't know why." Martin came closer but stopped before crowding her. He studied the clock face through the old towel's edge. She was trying to get somebody to ask the right question, most likely. Esther didn't leave things where they couldn't work. It doesn't work, so people kept saying. The first weak thread of irritation rose in Nora before she could stop it. I'm not being poetic. I slept in my car last night. I have a clock I can't sell for enough to matter, and a building I don't own with a hazard notice on it. If there's a right question, I could use the plain version. Martin looked at her then fully. He did not soften his face into pity. He only took a slow drink from the coffee and set the cup on the platform rail. Plain version is this, he said. The depot belongs to the township. They've been meaning to unload it for years. If no one gives them a reason not to salvage, men will take the brackets, flooring, doors, whatever they can pry loose. Mrs. Vale argued against it until she couldn't come to meetings anymore. Nora glanced at the notice. Why didn't she leave the building to somebody? Can't leave what you don't own. Rainwater slid from the broken gutter and struck a metal barrel below in irregular pings. Nora turned toward the ticket office window. Above it, under a darker rectangle of wall, 2 old screw holes marked where something heavy had once hung. The clock was there, she asked. Martin followed her gaze. For years. Ticket agent could see it from inside. Passengers could see it from the benches. Benches. He pointed toward the west end. Waiting room used to run that way. Later, they chopped the inside up for storage, bad work, fast work. Nora walked toward the sported west windows, counting her steps over the safer boards nearest the wall. The clock grew awkward in her arms. At the third boarded window, the pendulum case gave a faint vibration against her palm. She stopped. Martin noticed. What? I don't know. She shifted the clock higher. The vibration came again so slight she might have missed it if her fingers had not been resting on the little latch. Then, inside the case, the pendulum bob tapped once against wood. Tick. Nora's breath shortened. She turned away from the wall, and the case went still. Martin's eyes narrowed not with disbelief, but concentration. Hold it back where you were. She stepped again toward the west wall. The clock ticked once, then again. Not steady, not alive exactly. More like a tired machine finding a remembered slope. The minute hand trembled behind the cloudy glass. Martin set his coffee down hard enough that it splashed over the rim. Well, what is it doing? Maybe telling us Esther wasn't done being difficult. Nora almost laughed, but the sound caught before it formed. She held the clock facing the boarded windows. A draft moved along the platform carrying the smell of wet wood and iron. For 7 slow minutes the clock ticked in uneven intervals while the minute hand crept forward. Martin counted under his breath after the first minute, then took out a pencil stub and marked the platform post when the ticking stopped. The silence after was larger than before. Nora looked at the west wall. The beadboard panels behind the glass had been painted the same dull beige as the rest of the interior. But one seam ran vertical where the others ran horizontal. Near its edge, just visible through the cracked pane, was a tiny crossed pencil mark. The same angle, the same short line. Nora lifted one hand from the clock and pressed her fingers to the cold glass. Inside the depot, beyond the dead flies on the sill and the dust-heavy light, someone had made the same mark Esther had hidden inside the pendulum case. It waited there on the boarded wall, small enough to be dismissed by anyone not carrying the right broken clock. Martin stood beside her, quiet now. You said they chopped up the waiting room, Nora said. Yes. Could they have covered something? His answer came slowly. In a building like this, people covered things all the time. Drafts, damage, mistakes. Sometimes history if it was inconvenient. She looked back at the public, noticed its paper curling from damp at the corners, then at the clock in her arms. Esther had not left her a solution. Not money, not shelter, not a clean way out of the life folded into the back seat of her car. She had left her a question heavy enough to require both hands. Nora carried the clock to the old ticket office wall and set it carefully on the dry strip beneath the window. The brass face caught a pale band of afternoon light. For a moment, with the depot stretching around her, and Martin Reyes watching the west end as if it had spoken his name. Nora no longer felt like she had wandered onto someone else's property. She felt uneasily and for the first time in weeks expected. Nora returned the next morning with a borrowed flashlight, a roll of blue painter's tape, and a notebook June Bell had found in the municipal supply closet. The depot was colder inside than the air outside. Martin had gotten permission from the township road supervisor to open the ticket office door for visual inspection, only a phrase. he repeated twice before turning the old key as if the building itself might be listening for legal boundaries. The door, stuck at the threshold, swollen from years of damp, then gave with a woody scrape that sent dust loosening from the frame. "Stay where I step," Martin said. He went first, tapping each floorboard with the rubber end of a folding cane he had taken from his truck. Nora followed with the clock held against her ribs, trying not to breathe too deeply. The air carried old paper mouse droppings and the mineral smell of rain that had entered through roof seams and never quite left. Light came through cracked windows in narrow strips. It turned the suspended dust gold for a moment, then gray. The ticket office had been emptied of anything useful long ago. A counter divided the room, its varnish worn away where elbows must have leaned. Behind it, faint rectangles on the wall marked shelves that were gone. A rusted nail held a loop of telephone wire. Near the trackside window, 2 black screw holes sat high on the wall, exactly spaced to the bent hooks on the back of the clock. Martin nodded toward them. That's where it hung. Nora set the clock on the counter first, then lifted it carefully until the hooks met the holes. It did not sit securely. One hook had been twisted out of shape. Martin steadied the bottom with his palm. The clock remained silent. "Not here," Nora said. "Then we measure from here." He handed her the painter's tape. They worked slowly, not because the task was difficult, but because everything in the depot seemed capable of breaking from insult alone. Nora placed a strip of tape beneath the clock, then another on the floor where the counter ended. Martin paced from the old clock position toward the west end, counting heel to toe along the safer line near the interior wall. At 14 paces the floor changed tone under his cane. Not a crack, not a hole. A hollower sound, brief and boxy. Martin stopped. "Hear that?" Nora tapped with 2 knuckles. The answer came back dull from most boards, then sharper from one plank that looked no different except for a darker stain along its edge. She knelt and wrote in the notebook 14 paces west from clockwall hollow tone near partition. The west end had been cut off by a storage partition made from beadboard panels nailed over a frame of 2x4s. It did not match the older walls. The boards were too uniform, their paint newer beneath the grime, and the base trim died awkwardly into the corner instead of turning with the room. On the visible side, someone had stacked broken folding chairs, cardboard banker boxes, a rusted mop bucket, and a metal sign frame with no sign left in it. The crossed pencil mark was on the 3rd panel from the trackside windows. Nora took the clock from the ticket office and carried it toward the mark. This time, she did not wait for wonder. She watched the pendulum case, watched the minute hand, watched Martin's face. At 8 feet away, nothing. At 6, the pendulum bob gave one faint knock. At 4, the clock began to tick. The sound was uneven but unmistakable. A dry, mechanical pulse waking inside the wooden case. Nora set the clock on an overturned crate with its face toward the pencil mark. Martin took out his own watch, not his phone, an old silver one with a scratched crystal, and raised one finger. Start. For 7 minutes, they did not speak. The depot, filled with small noises that had been there all along, water dropping somewhere behind the freight room wall, wind moving a loose edge of tar paper on the roof, a squirrel fussing in the eave. The clock ticked through them all, not smoothly but with stubborn intervals. The minute hand crept forward as if dragged by thread. At 7 minutes and a few seconds it stopped. Martin closed his watch, same as yesterday. Nora marked the crate's position with tape. Why 7? Could be where the spring slips. Could be dirt in the works. He crouched before the partition and studied the crossed mark. Question is why it only bothers trying here. Here in his hand along the beadboard seam, not pushing, only feeling. This wall was put up fast. See these nails. Wire nails, bright common, once not cut nails. And the boards run different from the original wainscot. Whoever built this wasn't matching old work. They were closing something off. Could there be a room behind it? There was a waiting room behind it. Whether it's still a room or a nest for raccoons and mold, that's another matter. Nora swallowed. Can we open it? Martin looked up at the ceiling first. That answer told her more than a quick yes would have. Not until I know it isn't holding anything. It shouldn't, he said. Bad partitions sometimes become accidental bracing when a roof starts sagging. We don't pry mystery boards and let half a ceiling introduce itself. He sent Nora to hold the flashlight while he checked the top plate, the roofline above, and the side walls. His movements were slow but exact. He pressed a thumbnail into soft spots, measured gaps with the pencil stub, and made a quiet, disapproving sound at water stains above the west corner. Then he had her stand outside while he walked the platform and looked through the boarded windows from the trackside. Waiting alone. Nora found a timetable frame leaning behind the broken chairs. Its glass was gone. The paper inside had faded nearly blank, but along one edge she could see a column of station names and departure times printed in blue. Black ink. Someone had penciled small marks beside 3 times. One of them was crossed at the same angle as the mark inside the clock case. She carried it to the open door. Martin. He came back with damp on one shoulder from brushing under the eave. When she showed him the timetable, his expression sharpened. That's not random. What is it? Train time, maybe. Or a work mark. Section men marked where repairs were needed. Station agents marked schedules. Esther marked everything if she thought people would forget. He tapped the penciled cross. What time is that? Beside, Nora held the frame nearer the light. 7:10. The minute hand on the depot clock had stopped just past 12, but the number 7 had followed them now in sound and paper. 7 minutes, 7:10, 14 paces, twice 7. Nora did not say this aloud. It felt too fragile, too easily made foolish by hearing it. Martin took a flat pry bar from his tool bag but did not use it on the marked panel. Instead, he moved 2 panels over where the beadboard had already split near the bottom. If there's rot, we learn from where damage already started. The first nail squealed when he eased it loose. Nora flinched. Martin paused, letting the sound settle. He worked the bar under the edge again, rocking it by fractions. Paint cracked along the seam. A strip of beadboard bowed outward. Cold air slipped through. It was different from the depot's general chill. This air had been shut away. It carried dry dust, old wood, and something faintly sweet, like paper stored with cedar. Nora leaned closer despite herself. Martin held up a hand, mask first. He gave her a paper mask from his truck and put one on himself. Then he widened the gap with 2 careful pulls, enough for Nora to aim the flashlight through. The beam crossed emptiness. Not a closet, not a pile of junk tight against the wall. Space. The light found the edge of a bench, a curved wooden armrest, the corner of a painted sign, too dusty to read. Beyond it, another wall stood several feet back with tall windows boarded from the inside. The original waiting room had not been removed. It had been closed and left. Nora's hand shook. The flashlight beam trembled over the floor until it caught something small on the inside of the partition frame, a brass tag hanging from a nail by a loop of blackened string. Martin reached through the gap with 2 fingers and lifted it free. The tag was oval, dulled, almost brown, except where the string had protected a thin crescent of metal. Stamped into it were 3 letters and 1 word. W.R. Cabinet. Nora read it twice. Waiting room. Likely. On the back of the tag, someone had taped a tiny, folded square of paper. The tape had dried and curled away at the ends. Martin did not unfold it. He laid the tag in Nora's palm as if giving her something breakable. A blue corner showed inside the paper fold. Nora took it to the ticket office counter, where the light was steadier. With the patience of someone opening a wound that might still matter, she lifted the fold. Inside was a child's train ticket no larger than 2 fingers printed in faded blue ink. The destination line had blurred, but the station name, Bellwether, remained clear. On the back, written in pencil, was the same crossed mark. Below it were initials E.V. Esther Vale. Nora sat down on the dusty floor before she meant to. The clock was silent on the crate facing the partition. The waiting room waited behind a wall thin enough to touch and old enough to have outlasted everyone who pretended it was gone. Martin lowered himself onto the edge of the ticket counter with a careful bend of his bad knee. He did not ask if she was all right. My mother knew this place, Nora said. I don't know. Esther knew she did. That seems more likely. Nora closed her fingers around the brass key tag. It was cold at first, then warmed quickly against her skin. For weeks, every object she owned had felt like evidence of failure receipts, duffel, unpaid notices, the car itself. This was different. The tag did not solve anything. It added responsibility. It also gave her a task precise enough to survive the next hour. "What do we do now?" she asked. Martin stood and looked at the partition, the damaged floor, the ceiling stain, the public notice visible through the front glass. "Now we document before we disturb." Photos. Measurements. We called June, so the township knows we found an original room, not junk. We get the librarian if she has old plans. And we do not go crawling in there today just because our hearts got ahead of our sense. Nora nodded. She wanted to object to push to open the whole wall with her bare hands. Instead, she wrote everything down: WR cabinet tag, child ticket, EV initials room visible through gap bench inside sign inside the cold dry air. By late afternoon, June Bell had come in her cardigan and office shoes, picking her way over the platform with surprising steadiness. Martin showed her the gap. Nora showed her the tag and ticket. June read the initials and removed her glasses. "Oh, Esther," she said softly. The words were not an explanation. They were confirmation that the dead could still leave work for the living. Before they locked the depot again, Nora stood in front of the partition. Through the narrow opening, the flashlight beam rested on the waiting room bench. Dust lay thick across the seat. Under it, barely visible, someone had carved, and Nora could not read them yet. Martin touched the doorframe. "Tomorrow, we bring better light." Nora did not answer. She was looking at the gap where the false wall had pulled away a dark vertical line in a room that had been taught to forget itself. From the other side came no ticking, no voice, no sign except cold air and the smell of old paper. But the opening was there, and once seen it could not become a wall again. Martin brought a shop light the next day, and its white beam changed the waiting room from a secret into a responsibility. They did not tear the partition down. Martin removed only 2 beadboard panels beside the damaged strip, labeling their backs with pencil before stacking them flat against the ticket office wall. June stood by with her phone photographing each step for the township record. Celia Marsh from the library arrived in a navy raincoat with a plastic file box cotton gloves and the focused expression of a woman who had once scolded teenagers for folding page corners and had never regretted it. "Nothing leaves until we know what it is," Celia said. Nora nodded. The words felt less like a restriction than a promise. The opening was just wide enough for one person to pass sideways. Martin went first with a respirator and flashlight, testing the floorboards beyond the partition. He set his boot down in 3 places, waited, then motioned Nora in. The waiting room received her without drama. Dust softened the benches, the ticket board, the high trim around the windows. The air was dry, but close, as if the room had been holding one long breath since the day someone nailed the false wall shut. 3 benches faced the trackside windows. Their curved armrests were worn smooth where hands had waited on them. A small iron stove stood cold in the corner, its pipe disconnected and capped. On the far wall above a narrow cabinet, a painted sign read, "Women and Children," in letters faded to the color of weak tea. Nora stopped beneath it. She had expected fear, maybe, or some sharp discovery waiting to announce itself. Instead, she felt the strangeness of an ordinary room preserved past its usefulness. A place meant for sitting, warming hands, soothing children, watching for headlights down the track. Celia stepped in behind her, careful and quiet. This wasn't storage. No, Martin said. Storage doesn't need dignity. The cabinet below the sign was oak shallow and built into the wall between 2 studs. Its door had swollen tight at the bottom. The lock plate was tarnished but intact. Nora took the brass tag from her pocket, then realized the tag was not the key itself. On its loop hung a smaller, dark key she had mistaken for part of the string. Her fingers fumbled once before she steadied them. The key entered reluctantly. Martin leaned close but did not touch her hand. Gentle. Let the lock remember. She turned it a fraction. The mechanism resisted, clicked, and gave. Inside were 3 shelves. On the top shelf lay a stack of blue children's tickets bound with faded thread. On the middle shelf sat a cloth-wrapped ledger, long and narrow, the kind made for columns and careful sums. On the bottom shelf was a flat tin dispatch box with a label holder on the front. The paper inside the holder had browned almost to the color of the metal. In Esther Vale's slanted hand it read, "Waiting Room Promise." No one spoke for several seconds. Celia took one breath through her nose, then began giving instructions in a low voice. The ledger stayed supported from beneath. No pages turned until photographed. No fingers on ink. No unfolding letters until the paper had warmed away from the room's cold. Nora listened as if learning how to approach a sleeping person. They carried the items to the ticket counter where Martin had laid clean cotton cloth over a sheet of plywood. Outside wind pushed leaves along the platform. Inside the shop, light hummed. Celia photographed the ledger cover first. The cloth was dark green, frayed at the spine. When she opened it, the first page showed neat columns: date, name, town, train reason, assistance. Some entries were only one line. Others carried a mark in the final column: meal, blanket, fare paid, doctor sent, child watched. Nora bent over the page until Celia touched her sleeve. Not too close. Breath has moisture. Sorry. No apology. Just learning. The earliest entries were from the 1930s. Then the 40s. Wartime travel. Winter storms. Family stranded after a washout. A mother with 2 children waiting for a husband from the mill. The handwriting changed over decades, but the columns remained the same. By the late 1970s, the entries grew fewer. Then, around the time the mills began cutting shifts, they changed in character. Less travel. More need. Celia turned one page with a thin bone folder. Nora saw Esther's initials in the margin beside several names. Then she saw her mother's. Whitcomb Laura. October 9, 1986. Infant daughter. Rain closure. Room opened after hours. Soup dry, blanket fare held. Nora put one hand over her mouth. No image came at first. She had been an infant. There was no memory to retrieve, no buried picture of her mother sitting on one of those benches with Nora bundled against her coat. But the record itself made a kind of memory. Ink line, date, assistance. A public room opened after hours because someone thought a woman and child should not be left in the rain. Celia's voice softened. "Laura was your mother." Nora nodded once. Martin had turned away toward the window. His hand rested on the sill thumb, moving over a groove in the paint. When he faced them again, his eyes had reddened, but his voice remained steady. "My father's hand is on some of those repair notes," he said, pointing to a page tucked near the back. "He used to come down when the stove smoked." Celia opened the tin dispatch box last. Inside were letters bundled by decade. A small envelope of keys, and one sealed cream envelope addressed in Esther Vale's hand for Nora Whitcomb if the clock brings her here. Nora did not reach for it immediately. The room seemed to gather around the envelope: benches, stove, cabinet, blocked windows, the silent station clock on the other side of the partition. She untied her mother's scarf from her bag and laid it across her lap. Not for warmth, but for courage she did not want to name. Celia checked the envelope flap. "It's not brittle. You can open it if you go slowly." Nora slid one finger under the loosened edge. The letter was 2 pages written in blue ink that had faded at the folds. "Dear Nora, if you are reading this, then the old clock still knew its way home better than most people did. I owe you the truth, but not the kind that makes a spectacle of grief. Your mother came through this waiting room more than once when you were small. She was proud. She did not like needing help. Most people who came through that door were the same. That was why the room mattered. It let a person receive a blanket, a cup of soup, a phone call, a safe hour without having to stand in public and explain the whole shape of their sorrow." Nora stopped reading. The words blurred. She pressed the heel of her hand beneath one eye, careful not to touch the paper. Celia waited. Martin took off his cap. Nora continued. "When the depot closed, some wanted the room stripped and sold with the rest. A few of us objected. We saved what records we could and closed the room rather than let it be emptied by people who saw only old benches and scrap wood. I am not proud of the secrecy, but I am grateful the room survived long enough for someone gentler to open it. The clock was our marker. Your mother once noticed it had stopped during a storm and told me a waiting room needs a clock even if time is hard on everybody inside it. I never forgot that. There is more in these records than I can put in one letter. Names. Debts paid quietly. debts never meant to be collected. A promise about this room that belongs to the town more than to any one person. If you are able, find Martin Reyes. Find Celia Marsh. Let them help. Do not let anyone tell you the room is worthless because it does not glitter. Some things keep time because someone is still waiting. Esther Vale. The final line had been written darker than the rest, as if Esther had gone back over it. Nora lowered the pages. For a long while, the only sound was the shop light, the wind outside, and June's quiet movements as she took photographs without intruding. Nora had thought inheritance meant receiving what someone had owned. The clock, the tag, the ledger, the room itself were teaching her another meaning, being trusted with what someone had refused to abandon. She looked through the partition opening toward the ticket office. The depot clock stood on the counter, its brass rim dull, its face turned slightly away from them. It had not ticked since yesterday. What happens now, June asked, practical because someone had to be. Celia closed the ledger halfway, leaving a strip of cotton between the pages. Now we make an inventory. Then I request a temporary hold on the salvage review until these records are assessed. Can they still sell the building? Nora asked. June's silence told her enough before she answered. The township can do many things if no one gives them reason not to. Martin picked up the repair note he had recognized still inside its protective fold. Then we give them reasons. Start with keeping water out. If that roof corner fails, all the reasons in the world turn to pulp. Nora looked at the waiting room windows boarded from the inside light, trying to enter through nail holes and cracks. She thought of her mother here in 1986, wet from rain, proud and tired, accepting soup because an infant needed warmth. She thought of herself in the laundromat lot, hiding from the same kind of need under a different roof. The story had not saved her. Not yet. It had only made it impossible to pretend she was the first person to need a. As she folded Esther's letter along its old creases and placed it back on the cotton cloth. Then she tied her mother's scarf gently around the base of the depot clock so the fabric rested beneath the worn wooden case without covering the face. The waiting room dust drifted through the beam of the shop light. Beyond it, on the bench nearest the stove, the carved letters Nora had not been able to read came clear at last. Whatever morning comes. She stood looking at them until the words stopped feeling like a message from the past and became work for her hands. The first repair was not beautiful. It was a blue tarp dragged over the west corner of the depot roof while the morning wind tried to peel it out of Martin's hands. Nora stood below on the platform with one boot braced against a soundboard and both hands on the ladder, watching water drip from the slate edge into a bucket that already smelled of rust. Martin had refused to let her climb higher than the gutter line until he trusted the ladder, the roof, and her sense of balance in that order. Old buildings don't care how much you mean it, he called down. They care where you put your weight. Nora held the ladder harder. June had filed a temporary hold request before lunch the previous day. Celia had taken the most fragile papers to the library's locked local history room, each one photographed before it left the depot. The ledgers stayed in a padded box, labeled and logged, no longer just a secret, but not yet safe. The township had allowed 30 days for documentation before the surplus review continued. 30 days sounded generous until Nora watched rain slide under, rotten flashing, and realized paper could be lost in one bad storm. Martin showed her how to clear the gutter by hand, scooping black leaves, grit, and walnut shells into a 5-gallon bucket. He made her wear gloves and keep her sleeve out of the jagged metal seam. When the clog broke loose, water poured through the downspout with a hollow rush that startled a laugh out of her. There, he said, first victory, drainage. It did not feel like victory. It felt like mud under her nails, shoulders burning, and cold water running down the inside of her cuff. But when she looked through the waiting room opening and saw the floor beneath the cabinet staying dry, she understood why Martin had started outside. A room could not be honored if it was still being ruined. The platform taught Nora more slowly than any person could have. Martin marked unsafe boards with orange chalk and made her pry up the first one from the end, not the middle. The board resisted, then split, leaving a nail shank standing black in the joist. Nora cursed under her breath. Good, Martin said. She looked up. Good. Now you've met an old nail. They don't negotiate. They snap, or they tear what's around them. He showed her how to rock the claw bar against a scrap block so the pressure spread across the wood. He showed her the difference between punky rot and weathered surface gray between a joist that needed sistering and one that only needed drying. His hands were blunt, scarred at the knuckles, and careful with every tool. He never praised quickly. When she set a replacement board square and left the right gap for swelling, he only tapped it with his boot and said, "That one won't trip a child." It was enough. Nora still slept in the car, but not every night. June found her a church basement cot twice a week without making an announcement of it. The hardware owner, Mr. Phelps, let Martin put supplies on an account marked Depot Hold. And when Nora offered her last 20 toward screws, he pushed the bill pad back. "Pay by showing up," he said. "That's harder than cash for most folks." The words stayed with her as she drove back to the depot with a box of exterior screws on the passenger seat and the clock wrapped in her mother's scarf on the floorboard. It had become habit to bring the clock inside each morning and set it on the ticket counter facing west. It did not tick during the repairs. Its silence no longer felt empty. It felt like supervision. By the end of the week, 6 platform boards had been replaced near the ticket office door. Nora could walk from the gate to the entrance without plodding each step. It was a small path no wider than a person carrying a box, but it changed the way the depot received people. Celia noticed first. She arrived with acid-free folders and stopped at the platform edge. "Well," she said, looking down, "it has a front door again." Nora turned away before anyone could see how much that meant. Celia's work made less noise, but it asked for the same patience. Inside the waiting room, she set up a folding table beneath the safest window and covered it with clean cloth. Nora learned to number photographs before moving objects, to write descriptions without guessing, and to leave private pain private. A ticket with a name was not a story to publish. A ledger entry was not permission to expose a family. Celia was firm about that. "We preserve evidence," she said. "We do not spend other people's sorrow for attention." Together, they sorted the blue children's tickets, meal tokens, key envelopes, and repair notes. Nora found 3 slips for coal delivery to the waiting room stove, 2 receipts for blankets from the church sewing circle, and a note from Martin's father, written in blocky pencil stovepipe drawing. "Bad cleaned cap needs new elbow before winter." Martin read it once, then set it down carefully. He always wrote like the paper charged by the word he said. His voice had roughened. Nora pretended to be busy labeling a folder. The ledger entry with her mother's name stayed in its place. Celia made a preservation copy and gave Nora only the typed transcription because the original belonged to the record now. Nora folded the copy into her notebook and did not read it every day. Only some days. Only when the car felt too small and the town felt too full of windows. One afternoon, while cleaning dust from the bench nearest the stove, Nora traced the carved words with a soft brush. "Wait here. Morning comes." The letters had been cut by different pressure than a knife gouge. A careful hand. Someone with time to sit. Someone making instruction out of hope because hope by itself might not hold. "Don't clean all the age off," Celia said from the table. "I wasn't." "I know." Celia smiled without looking up. "I was reminding myself." The salvage buyer came on a Thursday with clean boots and a folded measuring tape. His name was written on the township sign-in sheet, but Nora forgot it almost as soon as June said it. He moved through the depot seeing lengths, not rooms. Oak flooring, cast iron brackets, ticket window, slate, brass. He was not cruel. That made him harder to hate. He spoke in the reasonable tone of a man discussing material before weather ruined it. "This place is past saving as a building," he said, tapping the freight room doorframe. "But pieces of it can live somewhere." Martin's jaw set. "Pieces don't remember what they were joined to." The buyer shrugged. "People say that until the roof caves in." Nora stood beside the ticket counter with sawdust on her jacket and a shallow cut across one knuckle. She knew the salvage offer before June said it enough to pay overdue storage, fix the car brakes, rent a room for a month or 2. Not wealth, not rescue, but enough to make the next week less frightening. Enough to tempt a person who had counted crackers for dinner. June did not push the paper toward her. She only set it on the counter. "You are not the owner," June said gently. "The township decides." but because Esther named you in connection with the clock and these records, your statement will be part of the review. My statement, Nora repeated. The buyer looked at her, then, maybe truly seeing her for the first time. Miss, I don't mean disrespect. Sentiment costs money. Water and gravity don't pause for good intentions. Nora almost nodded. She knew more about water and gravity than she had a month ago. She knew gravity in her shoulders after carrying lumber water in the West Corner bucket money draining from a wallet until every dollar had a job before it arrived. Reason sat on the counter in the shape of that offer. Then the depot clock ticked once. Everyone turned. It stood on the ticket counter scarf beneath its base face angled toward the waiting room. The sound did not continue. The minute hand did not move. It was only one tick, dry and small, but in the hush after it, Nora felt the whole building narrow to a choice. She picked up the salvage offer. The paper was warm from the buyer's hand. I know pieces can live somewhere else, she said. I'm living out of pieces right now. No one answered. She set the offer back down without signing anything. But that room was kept whole for 40 years by people who had less than this town has now. I can't tell the township what to do. I can only tell them it isn't junk. The buyer sighed not angrily and folded his measuring tape. Then, I guess you've got until the hearing. After he left late, light spread across the platform boards Nora had replaced. The depot looked no stronger from the road. The roof still sagged at the west corner. Paint still peeled in long curls from the clapboard. But inside, the ledger was cataloged, the waiting room was breathing clean air, and a narrow safe path led from the gate to the door. Nora stood in that path until the cold reached through her boots. For the first time, she understood that restoration did not begin when a place looked saved. It began when someone stopped agreeing that loss was practical. The final proof was not in the ledger. It was folded behind a depot route map that had been pasted to a thin backing board and slid into the lowest shelf of the waiting room cabinet where dust had sealed it so neatly, Celia almost missed the edge. Nora was holding the flashlight while Celia examined the board under the shop light. A corner had lifted where old glue failed, showing paper beneath paper. Don't pull, Celia said. Nora had not moved, but she lowered her hand anyway. They worked steamless and slow, using a thin spatula, clean weights and patience that felt almost ceremonial. The hidden paper emerged by inches. It was not a letter. It was a copy of a deed attachment from 1954. Stamped by the county recorder, its language formal and dry enough that Nora understood only every third phrase at first. June understood sooner. She read it once, then again, lips pressed tight. What does it mean? Nora asked. June set the page flat. It means when the railroad transferred this parcel to the township, the waiting room was reserved for public shelter, public memory, and non-commercial civic use. It doesn't make the building impossible to sell, but it makes stripping that room a legal problem and a public one. Martin let out a long breath. Esther, you stubborn woman. Nora looked through the opening at the benches, the stove, the carved words. The room had not survived by accident. Someone had known enough to hide the proof where only a person already protecting the room would find it. For the first time, the depot had a voice the township had to answer. Celia did not publish names. She wrote a short notice for the library board, and the township agenda, original depot waiting room discovered civic relief records under preservation review. Deed attachment located volunteers needed for weatherproofing and controlled cleanup. No private ledger entries. No family embarrassments, no dramatic claims. Still people came. A retired teacher brought a box of old Bellwether postcards. Mr. Phelps sent 2 tubes of exterior caulk and a note saying use before hard frost. A church sewing group washed curtains that could be saved and quietly made new plain ones for the windows that could not. One man, Nora did not know, dropped off a bundle of oak offcuts for bench repair, then left before anyone could thank him. Not everyone arrived with sentiment. One township supervisor came in with a clipboard and asked about liability, heating, mold, access, and cost. Martin answered with estimates instead of arguments. June supplied forms, Celia supplied documentation. Nora supplied the part she had photographs, measurements, and the simple fact that the room was no longer hidden. At the public hearing, Nora wore the green jacket because it was the only coat she owned, but June had brushed the sawdust from its shoulders in the hallway. Nora stood at the microphone with her statement folded once in her hand. The salvage buyer sat 3 rows back, not smirking, not cruel, only waiting. Nora did not tell them her whole life. She did not turn hunger into theater. She told them about the clock, about the partition, about a waiting room that had opened after hours for people who needed warmth without humiliation. She said her mother's name only once. Then she laid the copied deed attachment on the table and stepped back. The vote did not save everything. It did something more believable. It delayed the sale for 6 months, created a volunteer stabilization period, and allowed Celia to apply for a small county heritage grant. Nora walked out into cold evening air with no applause and no certainty. Martin stood beside her on the municipal steps. "That was enough for today," he said. For once, enough sounded like a real measurement. Winter narrowed the work. They could not paint. They could not replace every damaged board. They could not make the depot young, and Martin said any person trying to make an old building look young should be kept away from sandpaper. So they did what winter allowed. They sealed gaps. They scraped loose paint where water had already lifted it. They covered broken panes with clear panels cut to fit inside the muntins until real glazing could be afforded. Martin repaired the clock mount with oak blocks behind the ticket office wall strong enough to carry weight without splitting the old plaster. Nora cleaned the brass bezel with a cloth and mild soap stopping before the metal lost its age. "Leave the years on it," Martin said. "Just take off the neglect." The clockmaker in the next town cleaned the movement at a reduced fee after Celia showed him a copy of the archive notice. He found old oil thickened inside the pivots, a worn bushing, and a pendulum slightly bent from storage. He did not make it perfect. He made it honest. When Nora asked why it had run only near the waiting room partition, he touched the iron bracket that had once been hidden behind the beadboard and explained how a weak, dirty movement could be coaxed or troubled by angle vibration and old metal close to the case. "Not magic," he said. "No," Nora answered. "Better." By January, Nora had a room over Mrs. Bell's cousin's garage, paid partly by cleaning the municipal meeting room twice a week and partly by weekend shifts at the hardware store. The bed was narrow. The radiator clanked. The first night she lay awake because nothing in the room smelled like wet upholstery or cold vinyl. It took time for safety to become sleep. On Saturdays she worked at the depot. Her hands roughened. Her notebook filled with measurements receipts and Celia's catalog numbers. The waiting room benches stood cleaner now, their carved words protected under a clear archival note, original carving maker unknown. "Whittier, morning comes." Nora read it less often. She needed it less often. That felt like gratitude, too. The clock went back on the wall in February. Martin made Nora lift it with him, even though he could have done it faster alone. They stood on opposite sides of the ticket counter. The old case wrapped in a moving blanket, the brass face turned toward the room that had called it back. Nora guided the bent hooks onto the repaired mount. Martin held the bottom steady until the weight settled into the wall. Again, he said when it sat slightly crooked. They lifted, shifted, and set it once more. This time the clock hung level. The pendulum started with one careful push. For 20 seconds it ticked, then it stopped. Nora closed her eyes. Martin did not rush. He opened the case, adjusted the beat by a fraction, and set the pendulum moving again. Tick, pause, tick, pause. Then the pauses evened each sound, finding its place after the one before. The clock ran for 7 minutes, then 8, then 9. Nora stood with both hands at her sides, afraid to celebrate too soon. Celia came in carrying a box of copied records and froze near the door. June, who had stopped by with updated volunteer forms, remained on the platform with one hand on the frame. The clock kept time. It did not heal the roof or pay the bills or bring Nora's mother back to the bench by the stove. It did not turn Esther's promise into an easy future. But it made a sound large enough to gather people quietly around it. Nora tied her mother's scarf beneath the clock for one last photograph, then removed it and folded it into her bag. The clock did not need the scarf to be held anymore. Maybe neither did she. By March, the depot still looked old from the road. That was one of the things Nora liked best about it. The clapboard wore new primer only where weather demanded it. The platform had repaired boards set among silvered ones, honest patches under careful feet. The Bellwether sign had been cleaned but not repainted bright. On the morning of the first open waiting room hour, thin sunlight came over the rails and caught every scar the building had kept. Nora arrived early with a ring of keys June had signed out to her and a paper bag of muffins from the diner, where she had once been too ashamed to ask for extra shifts. She had part-time archive hours now funded through the small heritage grant Celia had won and matched by the township in a vote that passed with practical reluctance. It was not enough to make life easy. It was enough to pay for her rented room groceries that did not come from a gas station and a used coat for days when the green jacket had to dry by the radiator. She unlocked the depot door and stood a moment before entering. Inside the clock was already ticking. Martin had come earlier. She could tell by the swept line across the floor, the fresh wedge under the door, and the smell of coffee in the ticket office. He was in the waiting room, tightening the last screw on a bench arm that no longer wobbled. "You beat me here," Nora said. "Clock said I was late." She smiled and set the muffins on the counter. The waiting room had not been made into a museum that kept people at a distance. Celia had insisted on that. It was a room first. 3 benches repaired and rubbed with oil. The small iron stove cleaned, but not used, with a note explaining its history. A display case with copies of the Blue Children's tickets, 2 meal tokens, a repair note from Martin's father, and 1 ledger page reproduced with names redacted except where families had given permission. Esther's letter was represented by a short excerpt Celia had chosen for its dignity, not its drama. The original ledger rested at the library now. The deed attachment had been copied for the wall where anyone could read the dry legal phrase that had protected the room better than sentiment could have. Public shelter. Public memory. Non-commercial civic use. Nora ran a cloth over the ticket counter, though it was already clean. Her hands needed a task. At 10, June opened the platform door and let in the first visitors, a retired teacher, Mr. Phelps, from the hardware store. 2 women from the church sewing group and a boy of about 9 holding his grandmother's hand. No ribbon, no photographer, no speeches. The grandmother stood just inside the waiting room and looked at the benches. "My brother slept here during the flood," she said. "My mother never liked telling that." Celia, stationed by the display case with her notebook, answered gently. "You don't have to tell more than you want." The woman nodded and sat down. Her grandson sat beside her, swinging his feet above the floor. Morning light crossed his shoes and reached the carved words under their protective note. "Wait here. Morning comes." Martin saw Nora looking and lowered his voice. "You did good work." "We did. That too." The depot clock ticked above the ticket office doorway, steady and plain. Nora had learned its sound so well that she could hear when the building grew quiet around it. It was not loud, not grand, not the kind of sound that demanded notice. It simply kept faith with the room. Near noon the salvage buyer came. Nora saw him through the platform window and felt her shoulders tighten before she could reason them loose. He stepped inside without a measuring tape this time. In his hands was a narrow board of old oak, planed smooth and wrapped with twine. "I found this in my shop," he said. "Came from a depot bench years ago. Not yours, I don't think, but close enough in age." He held it out to Martin. "Maybe you can use it somewhere it won't look foolish." Martin took the board. Wood doesn't look foolish if it's asked to do honest work. The buyer gave a small nod, almost a smile, then looked at Nora. "I was wrong about one thing. Pieces remember less when they're alone." It was not an apology shaped for display. It was better than that. It was useful. They used the oak board 2 weeks later to repair the underside of the cabinet shelf where the old wood had split near the lock. Nora sanded only the edge that might catch a hand. She left the rest as it was. By spring 2nd month, Saturday open hours had become ordinary. That was another thing Nora liked. Ordinary meant a sign-in sheet with 6 names. Ordinary meant Celia correcting a date on a display label. Ordinary meant Martin complaining about a hinge and fixing it before anyone else noticed. Ordinary meant June stopping by after work, setting her cardigan over the chair and letting herself sit down for 5 minutes without a clipboard. People brought things: a timetable, a photograph of the depot under snow, a milk token found in a kitchen drawer. One man brought a story about his aunt waiting there for a train that never came, then meeting the neighbor who drove her home. Celia wrote what could be written and left the rest respectfully unwritten. Nora learned that stewardship was mostly repetition, unlocking, sweeping, checking for leaks after rain, answering questions, saying, "We don't know yet," without embarrassment, taking donations in a coffee tin that never filled fast but never stayed empty, writing thank you notes, returning the room to readiness every time someone left it changed by memory. On the first warm Saturday, she opened the west windows. The boards that had once hidden them were gone, saved in the freight room with pencil labels on their backs. The glass panes were imperfect, some old, some temporary, all clean enough for light. Air moved through the waiting room and lifted the corner of a copied ticket in the display case. Outside, weeds had begun to green along the rails. A young woman came in near closing with a backpack, damp hair, and the drawn look of someone deciding how little to say. She walked the room once, reading the signs without seeming to read them. At the carved bench, she stopped. "Can people sit here?" she asked. Nora looked at the bench, then at the clock, then at the woman's hands gripping the backpack straps. "Yes," she said, "that's what it's for." The woman sat. Nora did not ask why she had come. She went to the ticket office, poured coffee into a paper cup, and set it on the counter within reach, but not in the woman's lap, giving her the choice to accept it without performance. When the woman took it, she gave a small nod, eyes still on the floor. Nora returned to the doorway and stood under the clock. Some things keep time because someone is still waiting. The sentence came back to her without pain now. It had changed in the months since Esther's letter. At first it had sounded like obligation, then like grief. Now it sounded like a way to live, not waiting helplessly but keeping a door ready, keeping a room honest, keeping time for people who had lost track of it. When she closed the depot that evening, the young woman had gone, leaving the empty coffee cup rinsed and turned upside down by the sink. Nora swept the waiting room, checked the cabinet lock, and turned off the shop light. Martin claimed they needed, though the room had proper lamps now. The last light in the building came from the west windows. Its brass bezel held a soft reflection of her face, not as it had appeared in the rain-streaked car window months before, but steadier. Still tired sometimes, still careful with money, still carrying grief in places no one could see, but standing indoors with keys in her hand and work waiting for tomorrow. Outside morning's brightness had mellowed into late afternoon gold across the platform. The rails ran past the depot, into weeds and distance, no trains coming yet. The place no longer felt abandoned by movement. People had crossed its threshold again. They would again next Saturday. She locked the door, then looked back through the glass. Inside, above the ticket counter and the reopened waiting room, the old depot clock kept ticking.